Welcome back. This is lesson 21, Limiting Human Rights. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to review human rights and human rights legislation here in Canada and in the United States. And you'll be able to discuss circumstances when some may wish to either promote, while others may wish to restrict very specific human rights. So, to begin with, we have a couple links to remind you about the human rights legislation in Canada and the United States. If you're sitting there and you have no idea what's in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, if you have no idea what's in the U.S. Constitution and then the different amendments that are the Bill of Rights and the amendments after the Bill of Rights, then here they are. Take a look. Otherwise, let's dive into under what circumstances should we promote or restrict human rights. You know how I've been saying that it is important to be very specific in essays. So rather than talking in essays about restricting liberty, you need to talk about restricting specific liberty. Which liberty? Under what circumstances? And you need to also explore why is that liberty important? Well, today we are going to unpack some of that. So to begin with, we need to establish the significance of liberty. And Ayn Rand does an excellent job when she says the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be the defenders of minorities. So I'm a minority because I am one. I am an individual. And when you attack my individual rights with things like taxation, then that's a violation of my minority rights from the perspective of Ayn Rand. Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedom. It is the argument of tyrants. It is the creed of slaves. So we often say, well, freedom of speech is important, but right now it's necessary to restrict it. That's even the language within the Canadian Charter. Reasonable limits. The necessity, though, is the plea of every infringement of human freedom. So the logic in the preamble of the Canadian Charter is the same logic. Well, it's necessary. That Machiavellian, there's something in the end that's really important, but right now there's some means that are necessary. That Machiavellian logic, that's not just the logic of authoritarian leaders like Hitler and Stalin. It's being shown right there in Pierre Trudeau's document. And that quote, necessity is a plea for every infringement of human freedom, is questioning the ability of liberal countries to practice illiberalism, to take away our liberty. So, we have the freedom of speech. We have the First Amendment rights. So in America, again, First Amendment is a collection of rights. These are their fundamental rights. We call them fundamental in Canada. They're the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, the freedom to worship. And many would say, well, freedom of expression should be absolute. But I want you to think critically here. Are there some scenarios when you're like, well, now's not a good time for that. They shouldn't be doing that. Not here, not now. So the Westboro Baptist Church from the United States has been controversial. And part of the controversy surrounding the Westboro Baptist Church is that they like to get the public's attention during times that may seem inappropriate to others. So in 2008, the Westboro Baptist Church decided that they should protest outside the funeral of Tim McLean. And Tim McLean, as you may remember, in 2008, he was killed aboard a Greyhound bus on his way to Winnipeg. And the killing is very brutal. Vince Lee was the killer, and it included some cannibalism. And because it included some cannibalism, people within the Westboro Baptist Church decided that, this is going to get a lot of attention. We're going to go up to Winnipeg. We're going to go outside the funeral. We're going to be across the street from the family this morning. And you can see the signs that they had. Things like God hates the Americans, and the idea that Vince Lee's hand was the act of God, or that Vince Lee's actions was the hand of God because of the sins of mankind. That Tim McLean was the sacrificial lamb, and God's actions were through Vince Lee, and we were being punished for the crimes that we've committed. Not a lot of people, including those mourning across the street, felt that this expression should be happening at that time, that freedom of expression needed to be regulated, that there are some times that are too sensitive for protests such as this. Now, we do have others, like Voltaire, who famously said, "I may not agree with what you say, but I'll defend to your death the right to say it." So maybe Voltaire would have been on the side of the Westboro Baptist Church, saying that, what you're doing over there is the essence of liberty. You should be able to freely express what you believe. We also have George Birdy. George Birdy is a Canadian, former musician. He was the lead singer of a group called RAHOWA, which stands for a phrase called racial holy war. And George Birdy spent some time in jail. He spent some time in jail after inciting a riot at the foot of Parliament Hill and using a lot of violence against those who were protesting against him. George Birdy's music is very racially charged, and some would suggest that George Birdy and other white supremacist musicians shouldn't be able to create music that incites hatred and has incited riots. What about the freedom of thought? Many Americans are beginning to fear the expression of their free thought. They fear that they're not allowed to have the freedom of thought. That in the world of 2020, that their thoughts are no longer valued or going to be safe to express. So in many universities across America, the freedom of speech has been restricted in the sense that people have been attacked physically for speaking or promoting values that maybe much of the rest of that college community, they don't appreciate. We do have some professional agitators trying to shame the American government and try to reshape America. And one of the groups is Antifa. And definitely, I would expect that if we have a political essay in August, there will be a lot of people writing about Antifa and what they've been accomplishing in the streets of America during the year of 2020. Definitely, it's important to go back and look at these professional agitators, these activists, try to use violence to intimidate opposition into silence. What is the agenda of Antifa? And there's a link there for you to look at. Free speech can be a monster. Hate speech for one, hate speech for all. So we have free speech complaints, and we have 4 groups that they wouldn't agree with each other. Like, they don't love each other. Some of them might love each other. These guys might get along. But they each have a complaint that their freedom of speech is being taken away. Some have suggested that the attack on the freedom of speech is one thing that holds white supremacists and black supremacists together. In fact, the KKK and the Black Panthers once famously in New York City paraded together because the city was taking away both groups' freedom of assembly. What makes that hate speech? Sorry, what makes that free speech? What makes that hate speech in 2020? How come people are celebrating when they burn the American flag, but they're being painted as being insensitive and ultra-conservative when they burn a rainbow flag? So lots more diagrams about freedom of speech, and this is going to be in connection to the shootings in Paris with the Je suis Charlie program. I am Charlie. The video there, if you can't remember what this reference is. Some cartoonists were painting Islamic people and Muhammad in a non-favoring light, so some fundamental Islamic people thought those cartoonists need to die. How important is it to be able to question the government, to question the leader? In Canada, we could paint Justin Trudeau as being guilty of corruption and incompetence and cronyism. But in some other countries, if you do that, you face execution. You're not allowed to have that kind of discontent. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. What are the restrictions that we should have there? At what point does the Second Amendment become an obsolete amendment? At what point does the right to bear arms create more insecurity than security? The right to marry. Who should be allowed to marry? How many times can you marry? Can you have multiple wives, multiple husbands? Are there people within our communities you cannot marry based upon relationships? Maybe they're your close relations. In some states, there's very clear regulation of who can marry. At one point, it was based on gender. In many jurisdictions, it's still based upon relationships. You can't marry people in your immediate family. You can't marry multiple people. You can't have 47 wives. Can we regulate the right to marry? Or, when we regulate the right to marry, are we imposing our morals on others? What about religious rights? Are there some religions that may within them have their own set of legal system? And is it a legal system that we're comfortable being practiced in our communities at large? I'm looking at you, Sharia law. Many Canadians look at Sharia law and they're uncomfortable about their perception of what Sharia law could mean for their community. So Sharia law and some of the crimes and punishments that are covered underneath it, does that supersede Canadian law? Is a concern many Canadians have. What about the right to life? What about the right to kill? Under what circumstances do I have the right to defend my home? Do we have a castle doctrine in Canada? Under what circumstances does a doctor have the right to kill? Under what circumstances does a family have the right to ask for euthanasia for their dying loved one? Doctor-assisted suicide, definitely still a controversial topic. When should the state be able to take away one's right to life? When is the death penalty warranted? Maybe never. Can we truly say that everyone has the same right to a free and fair trial? Can we truly say that we have equality before the law? At the time of this cartoon, the answer was no. Because it seemed to be that the Supreme Court would decide that white individuals committing, extreme crimes, they can spend a life in jail. Colored individuals, they're going to get the electric chair. What about sexuality and gender rights? Pierre Trudeau once famously said in 1967, this is how the man is such a pioneer. Decades before it was a conversation by others. There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. What's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code. So Pierre Trudeau in 1967 was talking about how the fact that the government cannot try to regulate morals by trying to define gender relationships. Who can marry who? Who can partner with who? Pierre Trudeau is saying, it's not our job. But it is interesting, he says, in the bedrooms of the nation. There's some privacy there, right? So Montreal 1975, we have some solidarity of some homosexual men, gay pride parades. Later on, we have in the 1980s, people arguing that then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was violating their basic human rights. When Brian Mulroney was trying to label homosexual action as absurd or obscene. Obviously, gender roles have changed. Roles of prisoners, the rights of prisoners. Under what circumstances do we take the freedom of movement away? Well, we take that freedom of movement away from prisoners all the time. But are there others within our communities that we don't want walking freely among us? There's a playground over there. Or there's some people in our community that should not be allowed to go into a playground because of things they've done in their past. Should we have a violent crime or a violent criminal registry program in our communities? Do we want to know where the sex offenders live so that we can ensure that we protect our families from that? What about the freedom of movement of non-Americans into America? Migrant caravans? Or are these just children that are going to end up being in those cages? Language rights. In Quebec, Bill 101. To protect the French culture, they passed a bill that forces all signs to be French. This cartoon is suggesting that that's very similar to what we saw in Germany in 1934 with the Nazis. Probably not a comparison that the French wanted to have in Quebec, but they don't seem to care. Here's some more review of what Bill 101 was and remains, and its impact on Anglophones. And here's a reference to the Rosa Parks. Anglais? To the back of the bus. You are not an equal citizen in Quebec. You are an Anglophone. You don't have the same rights, is the suggestion of the cartoon. And there's some other stuff about Bill 101 there as well. We have a multiple choice question for you to unpack with the answer already highlighted for you, so that's nice. I want you to learn more about Quebec's Charter of Social Values, Bill 62. And there's some links here to go into more detail there as well, about how they're trying to regulate and police the expression of one's culture in public spaces. We also have rights as consumers, rights as workers, to be protected in the marketplace. Do I have a right to a peanut butter sandwich? Do I have the right to air travel? Do I have the right to refuse medicine? When there's a vaccine to COVID-19, can I say, I don't want that? Even though it's in the collective interest, the common good, for everyone to take it so that we achieve herd immunity, can I say, I don't think so? I think that there's going to be a chip in that, and I don't want to be chipped by the federal government. I don't trust the government. Is water a right? What about statues? Should we honor the past, or should we take down those statues? And we've already talked about this in the past. In the future, will technology have a right? Am I violating the right of this computer by making it work too hard today? And then we have some enrichment. And the enrichment in here is only for extra reading if you feel so inspired. And the enrichment is basically talking about, with rights, are there responsibilities? What a concept. All right, there's lesson 21, human rights.